Have you ever wondered what it would be like to experience something truly unexplainable? Something so terrifying that it stays with you long after the lights go out? Well, you're about to hear 3 chilling tales that might make you rethink turning off the lights tonight. These aren't your average ghost stories. No, these are real, documented encounters. Each one a terrifying glimpse into the unknown, and each one just might leave you questioning the safety of the world around you. When we arrived at the Renfield residence, the first thing I noticed was that the front door was left half open. This was supposed to be my first visit to their home. I could see that there was no car parked out front, but the driveway still bore visible tire marks. The garden around the house also showed mild signs of neglect, with overgrown bushes, a few scattered weeds and grass that had become somewhat unruly. It was hard to tell whether this was a sign of unexpected abandonment or simply lazy upkeep. My husband Richard gently knocked on the door, his fingers idly brushing the handle of his gun at his side, just in case. "Mr. and Mrs. Renfield," he shouted, his voice echoing across the front patio. I stood right behind him, with our 6-year-old son peeking out from behind me. There was no response. After almost a minute of waiting, my husband decided to go in and take a look. "Stay here," he said, as he unholstered his weapon and stepped inside. When he pushed the door wide open, I immediately caught a glimpse of the living room. It appeared as though the Renfields had left in a hurry, leaving most of their belongings strewn about. The back screen door, left ajar, slowly creaked open and shut with the breeze. "Mr. Renfield?" he called out again as he surveyed the room. "This is Sheriff Parkins. Is anyone home?" Richard next instinctively pointed his gun at the ceiling when he heard footsteps emanate from the upper floor. The sound seemed to move away and gradually fade as it eventually led toward the staircase across the living room. "Whoever you are, be careful now," he cautioned loudly. "Please make your way down the stairs slowly and calmly." I honestly didn't know what to expect as I held onto my son Alex tightly near the doorway. Maybe it was one of the Renfields themselves coming down the stairs, or perhaps a burglar who had slipped in through the open door, or even a homeless person seeking shelter for the night. But instead, a large German shepherd appeared, his eyes locked on Richard as he descended the stairs. He looked menacing with each step he took, his fur bristling, muscles coiled, as though preparing for a confrontation. "Easy there, boy," Richard said in a low, soothing voice, his weapon still pointed at the animal. "I'm not here to hurt anyone, buddy. Let's keep things calm, all right?" He took a cautious step back as the dog reached the foot of the stairs, trying to signal that he meant no harm. My husband glanced briefly at me and Alex, then refocused on the dog, careful not to make any sudden moves. The German shepherd barked twice, baring his teeth, his gaze locked on Richard as it took a tentative step forward, almost expecting him to retreat further in response. But Richard didn't budge this time, and the dog's stance grew more aggressive. A deep growl rumbled in his throat as he bared his teeth even further, taking another deliberate step forward, poised to attack at any moment. In an instant, my 6-year-old suddenly broke free from my grip and rushed into the house. "Alex!" I yelled after him, panic surging through my chest. I'm not sure what exactly happened next, but the dog's stance immediately relaxed. He sat on his hind legs, with his tail swaying slightly as he looked at Alex. Before either of us could react, Alex placed his hand on the dog's head. "You must be Kripke. Nice to finally meet you," he said, patting the dog gently. The German shepherd's ears twitched, but he remained seated, his tail wagging more vigorously as Alex stroked his fur. My heart raced, unsure of what was happening, but the tension in the air had shifted entirely. Richard heaved a sigh of relief and cautiously lowered his weapon, looking equally confused. Before we had any time to process the situation, Kripke suddenly bolted up the stairs, prompting Alex to chase after him, with Richard and me quickly following suit. He led us straight to the last room on the upper floor and stopped next to a closet. It was clear the room belonged to a little girl, with pink-colored walls and a small bed dressed in fairy-patterned linens. Yet it had an air of neglect. Unwashed plates and bowls of cereal lay scattered across the floor, adding to the sense of disorder. Richard, with Alex now by his side, silently motioned for him to stay back. Slowly, he opened the closet door, and I immediately recognized Lily. She was sitting inside, crouched on her knees, her index and middle finger in her mouth, and her eyes wide with nervousness. Her gaze darted between the three of us as she continued to suck on her fingers, looking vulnerable. Finding her in such a state, the reality hit me. She had been abandoned by her own family. The thought of her enduring such isolation made my heart ache with sadness. The Renfield family had moved to our town only 6 months ago. I first met them during Mass at church, where they appeared to be a typical, if somewhat private, couple who mostly kept to themselves. Their 6-year-old daughter, Lily, was in the same class as my son. The two kids quickly became friends, and when Lily missed 3 days of school in a row, Alex grew concerned. He kept insisting that we check on her family at their home. Richard had just then returned from a grueling overnight sting operation with the city police and was already looking exhausted and worn out. Despite his fatigue, he agreed to come with us to check on the Renfields on our way to school. But what happened to the girl's parents? I wondered silently as my thoughts returned to the present. Why did they leave her alone in the house with no one to care for her? Meanwhile, Alex knelt in front of Lily and gave her a gentle hug, while Kripke calmly stayed by their side, his tail wagging softly. Richard and I then helped Lily climb out of the closet and onto the bed. She continued to suck on her fingers, a clear sign of her distress. I gently took her hand away and wiped it with a towel. Her pajamas, which hadn't been changed in several days, looked crumpled and soiled with food stains. Richard then left to check the room across the hall that belonged to the parents. When he returned, his expression revealed that it had been completely cleared out. I couldn't help but wonder again why the Renfields would suddenly abandon their only child. With no immediate answers available, I quickly packed a bag with some of Lily's clothes and toys from her room and escorted the kids and Kripke back downstairs to get to our car. We decided it was best to let Alex skip school for a couple of days so that Lily felt comfortable while she stayed in her home. When we finally arrived at our residence, I saw tears trickling down Lily's face. In this new and unfamiliar environment, it seemed to dawn on her that things were changing faster than she could process. She was already starting to miss the comfort of her own home. Lily slowly stepped out of the car, holding Kripke's leash, while Alex took her other hand and gently led her inside the house. When I stepped into the living room, a foul smell immediately hit me, wafting from the kitchen. I silently gestured for Alex to take Lily to the spare room at the end of the hall. Richard and I then cautiously made our way to the kitchen to investigate the strange odor. There, on the kitchen counter, we found a gutted pigeon, left for dead. Next to it, a family photo of me, Richard, and Alex lay flat, with a single bullet placed ominously on top. I saw the color immediately drain from Richard's face. He had been working with the FBI to take down a regional drug cartel, and just hours earlier, they had raided their base. While they seized millions in drugs and arrested over a dozen people, a few key members, including the ringleader, had evaded capture. Richard assured me he would deploy deputies around the house, and that they would also soon catch the ones on the run. We then quickly cleaned the kitchen to ensure the kids didn't walk in on the disturbing scene. A few minutes later, I helped Lily change out of her old clothes and gave her a quick bath, while my husband tended to Kripke, ensuring he was well fed and comfortable. We did our best to make Lily feel at home, but it was clear she was missing her parents. She handed her dad's number to Richard, asking him to call it and contact her father, her eyes all the while brimming with hope. Somehow she felt with him calling, the outcome would be different. However, when the number proved unreachable, Lily simply sat in a corner with Kripke and refused to eat. No amount of cajoling by me or Richard seemed to make a difference. Even Alex tried to help by bringing her a plate of food, but it remained untouched. Fortunately, things started to look up a couple of hours later when Alex pulled out a wooden top from his pocket and dangled it in front of Lily to grab her attention. With careful precision, he wound the string tightly around the grooved pear-shaped toy, then yanked it sharply in one fluid motion. The top bobbed in the air for a moment before landing on its metallic tip, spinning smoothly on the ground. The trick worked. Lily's eyes followed the top as it danced in graceful arcs, looping and wobbling across the floor in mesmerizing circles. But Alex was not done yet. He expertly looped the string around the spinning metallic tip and yanked at it again with greater force. The top bobbed in the air once again, only to land on the palm of his hand this time, and continued to spin unobstructed. Smiling, he walked over to Lily and gestured for her to hold out her hand. She hesitated, looking unsure at first, but eventually complied, and Alex deftly transferred the spinning top to her waiting palm. Lily almost broke into a smile as the rotating top tickled her skin, almost. But the distraction helped her to snap out of her melancholy. When I brought 2 large bowls of soup for Alex and her a few minutes later, she accepted hers without a word. I quietly watched as the 2 children ate their meal in silence. Once Richard got back to the office, he issued a bolo for Lily's parents and began searching for any living relatives who might be willing to take her in. During his investigation, he discovered that both Mr. and Mrs. Renfield had grown up as orphans in the same orphanage before eventually marrying each other. They had adopted Lily from the church when she was just 1 year old, and she had been under their care ever since. Armed with this information, my husband realized that without any immediate relatives to contact, he had no choice but to involve child services. The case officer informed him that, due to a backlog of cases in neighboring regions, it would take a couple of days before a representative could come to our town. In the meantime, we decided to let Lily stay with us until the authorities could take over. On one hand, Lily was showing signs of improvement as she started to relax around us, especially with Alex's constant efforts to make her feel comfortable. Richard, on the other hand, was another matter. He still hadn't fully recovered from the shock of the morning's events. Being in a small town with limited manpower, I knew he had extra reasons to worry about our safety. But it didn't help that he kept tossing and turning in bed, conducting perimeter checks around the house every hour throughout the night. The following day, which happened to be a Sunday, we all stayed in. As the 4 of us sat in the living room, the oppressive silence finally got to me. I stood up from the couch and planted myself in front of Richard. "Honey, I've been telling you for a long time that I want you to join me for ballroom dancing. You've postponed it for years, but today we're going to change that." I picked up the remote and turned on a rerun of Dancing with the Stars. "Come on, it's now or never," I said, extending my hand as I watched my husband sit there, looking absolutely stupefied. "Are you really going to let your wife feel embarrassed in front of the kids?" I added, raising an eyebrow at him. With a sigh, Richard finally stood up and took my hand, and we began to dance, spinning in awkward circles around the living room. A moment later, Alex joined in, taking Lily's hand and putting on a little performance of their own. It didn't take long for me to realize that the men in the Parkin household are terrible dancers with 2 left feet. But for the first time, I saw Lily laugh out loud as Alex fumbled and tripped through the simplest of steps. Even Kripke got in on the fun, joyfully dancing solo, spinning in clockwise and counterclockwise maneuvers whenever he got the chance. This was followed by a sumptuous lunch, where Richard and I took charge in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and stirring pots. The children also eagerly joined in, with Alex carefully peeling carrots while Lily arranged various spices and ingredients on the counter. By the time we sat down to eat, a sense of togetherness wrapped around us like a warm blanket. When Monday finally arrived, it was time to take Lily to meet her case officer, and the meeting was set up in Richard's office. I packed some sandwiches for her, feeling a mix of emotions in my heart, even though she had only been with us for a couple of days. As I handed the sandwiches to Lily, I did my best to allay her fears, reassuring her that she was in good hands and that everything would turn out all right. She nodded silently and gently wrapped her arms around my legs in gratitude. We all then got in the car together as Richard started for the office. He stopped en route at the gas station to fill up the tank. I stepped out to get a bottle of water from the nearby store, and Alex ran after me, eager to buy a send-off present for Lily. Richard mentioned that he would park the car at the edge of the gas station near the exit, so he could check the air pressure too. He went ahead and parked it just ahead of the storekeeper's pickup. As I entered the store, I noticed an old Lincoln pull up and take the spot Richard had just vacated. The gift selection was limited, but a cute panda stuffed animal caught Alex's eye, and he immediately reached for it. As we approached the counter, I noticed a man of medium height and stocky build casually walk into the store. He looked to be in his early 50s and was dressed in a suit, with a cap pulled low over his face. The man grabbed a pack of gum from a nearby stand and placed it on the counter. When the storekeeper mentioned the price, The man nodded as if reaching for his wallet, but instead he pulled out a pistol and, without hesitation, shot the storekeeper point blank in the face. He then turned to me, his expression eerily calm. "Good morning, Mrs. Parkins. How do you do?" he asked, breaking into a smile. "I'm Steve, your friendly neighborhood drug dealer. Glad we could finally meet." As I stood paralyzed in shock, my body instinctively moved to shield my son, but Steve was quicker. He yanked the collar of Alex's shirt, pulled him close, and aimed the pistol at his head. "Don't try to be a hero today, Mrs. Parkins," he said, his voice ice cold. "Your husband already tried that, and you see where that got him." My eyes automatically gravitated towards our car parked at the edge of the gas station, where I saw Richard frantically alight and run towards the store with a gun in his hand. I watched in agonizing detail as Richard's expression shifted from resolve to complete horror upon realizing we were being held hostage, causing him to stop just short of the store's entrance. To make matters worse, the two individuals from the Lincoln parked near the gas pump also emerged from their vehicle and took up positions behind Richard. They were unmistakably part of Steve's crew. One of them snatched the gun from Richard's hand and tucked it into the small of his back, while the other kept his firearm trained at him. Steve then escorted me and Alex out of the store, while his sidekicks kept a watchful eye on Richard. "Get on your knees," Steve ordered, leveling his weapon at us as we approached one of the fuel pumps. "Isn't this how you had us surrender when you raided my place?" he taunted Richard, glancing over at him as he mockingly clasped his hands behind his head. Alex and I knelt just inches apart, with one of Steve's henchmen looming behind us. Richard stood 10 feet away, his back to the store, with another gunman aiming at him, while Steve remained near the other pump, casting glances between us and Richard. In the middle of all this chaos, I also worried about Lily. The last thing I wanted was for her to be dragged into this nightmare. The dealers so far seemed completely unaware of her or Kripke. Their attention was focused solely on Richard and us, and I prayed they wouldn't think to check the car. Thinking about Kripke, I also immediately worried over how Lily would be able to control him amidst all this commotion. I stole a quick glance at our car, and from a distance it did look empty. But for those who knew, it was impossible not to miss Lily's forehead peeking up from above the back seat, her eyes fully focused on the event unfolding in front of her. Kripke was nowhere in sight beside her, and my heart pounded away in my chest when I spotted him crouched beneath the storekeeper's pickup truck. He had already sneaked out of our car and was silently lying in wait. His body was coiled tight, and his expression was fierce. Just as it had been when I first met him, he looked poised and ready for a fight. My thoughts were interrupted suddenly when I heard my husband's voice break through the silence. "This is between you and me, Steve. They have nothing to do with this. It's me you want. Release them and let's sort this out like we need to." Richard finally spoke, trying to stay calm despite the gravity of the situation. Steve nodded with exaggerated silence and snapped his fingers at one of his crew members, who went by the name Softy. Softy walked over to the old Lincoln, pulled a baseball bat from the back seat, and delivered a crushing blow to Richard's leg, sending him crashing to the ground in agony. Alex and I watched in horror as he writhed in pain. Softy then held the bat horizontally, clamping it down on Richard's throat from behind as he struggled to maintain his balance. "If only life were that simple, Sheriff Parkins," Steve said, pulling a cigar from his coat and slicing it with a cutter. "All you had to do was look the other way. We weren't even operating on your radar. We had in fact set up a base well beyond the confines of your town, but you had to dig around and notify the big boys anyway. Do you have any idea how unhappy you've made my employers? How many millions of dollars in product have been lost because of you? Do you think our families are safe now, considering what has happened?" Steve's voice was laced with anger, echoing the frustration of his crew. "So why should I let you or your family go, Sheriff Parkins?" Steve asked, his expression deadly serious. He then placed the unlit cigar in his mouth and walked over to where Alex and I stood. He removed the fuel nozzle from the gas pump next to us and began dousing us in gasoline. Richard struggled to push himself up, his eyes wild with panic as he saw the gasoline seep into our clothes. "Stop," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. Softy rammed the knob of the bat into his ribs, leaving him wheezing and doubled over in pain. "I'm afraid it's far too late for that, Sheriff," Steve said, lighting his cigar and taking a slow, deep drag. Smoke swirled around him as he continued, "When this place burns to the ground, your faces will make the headlines tomorrow." He twirled the cigar between his fingers, pacing deliberately around us, dangerously hovering over the gasoline-soaked ground. "Hopefully that will send the right message to the entire county and maybe even help us regain favor with our bosses," he added, a twisted grin forming as he savored the moment. I suddenly felt a throbbing pain in my head. I couldn't tell if it was from the constant inhalation of fumes after being doused in gasoline, but it was a strange sensation. It felt like a small voice somewhere deep inside me was trying to break free, as if it were asserting itself within my consciousness. So much so that it started to filter out all the noise around me as I watched Steve continue to address my husband, but I couldn't hear a word of what he said. And the voice in my head only grew louder and louder until I heard it finally utter my own name. "Mrs. Parkins, can you hear me? Mrs. Parkins." My eyes subconsciously drifted towards Lily, and she was looking right back at me. Before I could even answer yes to her, I somehow realized she already heard it, and she began speaking again. "Mrs. Parkins, on the count of 3, I need you to grab Alex and drop to the ground. Are you with me?" I felt my son silently tugging at my arm, his eyes locked on mine, focused and determined. He already knew what to do and was ready. My gaze shifted instinctively to my husband, Richard, who caught my eye for a fleeting moment, even while fighting against Softy's grip. He blinked at me just before another blow landed on him, and in that moment, I understood that Lily had managed to reach him too. And then I heard the countdown start in my own head. 1, 2. I grabbed Alex, and together we collapsed to the ground. As my body hit the asphalt, I watched Kripke bolt from beneath the truck, racing towards Softy. In that instant, Richard seized the bat pressing against his neck, yanking it down with all his strength. Softy suddenly staggered forward, his body arching over Richard as he briefly lost his balance. In a flash, Kripke leaped, his jaws locking around Softy's throat and tearing into it with savage force. Blood sprayed as chunks of flesh flew from Kripke's mouth, even before his feet touched the ground. Just as Softy was about to hit the ground with a thud, face first, Kripke launched himself into the air once again, this time aiming for the man positioned behind me. The next few seconds unfolded in a chaotic blur. I saw Richard lunge for the gun tucked in the small of Softy's back. Without thinking, I wrapped my body around Alex, trying to shield him as best as I could, and I closed my eyes just as a barrage of gunshots erupted from all directions. When the gunfire finally subsided, I cracked my eyes open and looked around. Alex was fine and unhurt, and I silently advised him to remain motionless on the ground. The person behind me lay dead, shot in the chest. Turning my head, I saw Softy on the ground, his hand feebly trying to cover his mutilated neck as he gasped for air. A few feet away, Richard lay sprawled out, unresponsive, a small pool of blood slowly forming beneath him. Panic gripped me as I rushed over. He'd been shot in the gut, and I realized he had lost consciousness. A bullet had narrowly grazed his head. Looking up, I noticed a pistol lying a few feet away, but before I could react, Steve's voice cut through the air. "Don't even think about it. Back away. Back away right now or I'll blow your brains out," he warned, his voice trembling as he waved the gun at me. His hand shook violently, and blood dripped down his left shoulder from a large gunshot wound. He walked closer and kicked the gun away from my reach. I could not have used the firearm anyway, not when I had been doused in gasoline. But Steve was already busy trying to track Kripke, who I assumed had moved to the other end of the fueling lane, likely hiding behind the Lincoln. It was hard not to notice a small trail of blood curve around the fueling bay and led all the way to the car on the other side. Steve first desperately tried to steady his trembling hand by gripping the gun with both hands, only to realize he was still holding a lit cigar, now mangled between his fingers from all the chaos. Frustrated, he flung it behind him, where it landed on a dry patch of ground, safely away from the fuel pumps. Tightening his grip on the gun, he limped toward the other end of the fueling bay. He reappeared in front of the Lincoln, gun raised, carefully scanning the area for any sign of Kripke. He noticed the trail of blood too. Just as he was about to stoop and peer under the car, Kripke lunged from beneath, causing Steve to stumble back and crash into the nearby pump. Despite the shock, he managed to hold on to his weapon, and as Kripke's jaws came dangerously close to his face, Steve fired 3 quick shots into the dog's body. When Kripke's lifeless body slowly crumpled to the floor, a loud guttural cry suddenly pierced through the air. A lump formed in my throat as I watched Lily in the back seat of the car, her small fists pounding helplessly at the headrest in front of her as she sobbed uncontrollably. Even Alex broke into tears, his gaze fixed on Kripke lying motionless on the asphalt. Steve, still reeling from the sudden attack, looked flabbergasted as he turned and noticed Lily for the first time. He flailed his weapon aimlessly in confusion, struggling to regain his footing. His legs wobbled again, and he hit the ground hard when he saw Lily standing a mere 10 feet away from him. She had emerged from the car, her face contorted into a cold stare as she sucked on her fingers. I watched Steve's hand tremble again as he slowly raised the gun to aim at Lily, but my gaze was fixated on the fuel nozzle that had detached from the pump on its own. In open-mouthed horror, I saw it hovering in the air behind Steve. The hose attached to the nozzle snaked around his torso like a python, causing him to jerk back and lose his grip on the weapon. The hose then yanked him with such force that his body slammed against the metallic column next to the pump, coiling upward to emerge through the open neck of his coat. It wrapped around his throat, pinning his head to the pole as he began to choke. Steve desperately tried to reach for his fallen gun, but it lay just out of his grasp. As the hose continued to tighten around his neck, the nozzle began to slowly point upwards, and then I saw gasoline erupt out of it like a fountain, drenching Steve completely from head to toe. Lily continued to watch, her head slightly tilted and fingers still in her mouth. At that very moment, I felt a voice go off in my head. Please help Mr. Parkins get to the car. I rushed to my husband, with Alex joining me as we tried to wake him. He was still fading in and out of consciousness, but was lucid enough to let us help him get him off the ground. As he wrapped his arms around me and Alex, we hurried to the car as fast as I could. Once I got him settled inside, Alex raced over to where Lily stood. He pulled a top from his pocket and began to string it right beside her, then yanked at the string as the top hit the ground and started to spin furiously. The small circles gradually grew bigger as the top continued to spin on its axis, until it began to trace loops around the gas station like a car on a NASCAR track. Steve watched in wide-eyed disbelief as the top defied the laws of physics, bouncing along the asphalt at will, indulging in a series of mini hops, while skillfully avoiding the puddle of gasoline that had formed an island on both sides of the fuel pumps. When the metallic tip eventually made contact with the gasoline, the liquid fuel splashed upwards, enveloping itself completely around the wooden surface. In that moment, time began to slow down as I watched the top spin, making its way towards the discarded cigar, brushing against the lit end and igniting into flames. Now ablaze, the top committed itself to one final lap around the station, leaving a trail of fire in its wake. "Alex, get to the car!" I yelled, as I lifted Lily into my arms and raced toward the vehicle with all my strength. When I turned the ignition, I glanced back one final time, catching the look of sheer terror etched in Steve's eyes as he watched the fiery top spin directly toward him. I shifted gears and sped away, heading to the nearest hospital as the station became engulfed in flames, with Steve's anguished cries echoing behind us. It's been 3 weeks since the incident at the gas station, and Richard thankfully is en route to making a full recovery. He has also started the legal process of adopting Lily into our family, which I should say makes me happy. We can't hand her over to child services now, not after all that has happened, and I always wanted a daughter, and now I feel like the family is complete. Yet I still find myself experiencing sleepless nights every once in a while, haunted by memories of that day. I've brought Richard up to speed about the events of that fateful encounter, but he does not have a true measure of Lily's ability like I do. He was unconscious and missed almost everything, and Alex is too young to truly understand, even though he witnessed it all. But those worries melt away whenever I look at Lily and see her smile at me. Still, a lingering fear persists deep within me. Perhaps it will go away with time. I hope it will. Deep in the mountains of Georgia is a remote town called Deadly Falls. You won't find it on any map, except Google Earth, if you happen to come across it at just the right time of day. Even if you knew exactly where this town is and went over to it, you would find nothing except trees for miles. How do I know it exists? The answer is simple. It's where I was born and spent the first 12 years of my life. If you happen across it while on a road trip, you may think it a nice little place, quiet, lots of scenery, and a community so self-sustaining the idea of outside contact is laughable. The issue is that this comes at a price. Tommy, psst, Tommy! Groggily, I lifted my head up from my desk to find my best friend Amanda shaking my shoulder. Our math teacher was explaining some word problems. I wasn't paying attention, being focused on Amanda and wiping the drool off my face. What? I snapped back louder than I intended. Mr. Ballard, were you sleeping again? Our teacher asked. No, Mrs. Hooper, I answered, suppressing a yawn. Her narrowed eyes studied me for a moment before she returned her attention to the board. When she did, Amanda immediately picked up where we left off, as if we hadn't been interrupted. So you know the equinox is coming up, right? What about it? Leaning into my ear, she told me, I think we should get a picture of the fall fairy. Mrs. Hooper dumping a cup of ice water in my head wouldn't have made the tiredness leave my body faster than those words did. Amanda had the foresight to put a finger to my lips before I could have another outburst. She glanced at Mrs. Hooper, who was watching another kid in our class trying to solve a problem on the board. Amanda lowered her finger. Are you crazy? I asked her. The fall fairy was the local legend. Here's how it went. In the forest outside of town lies a cave that only appears during the equinox. That's its home. On the first day of fall, it comes out to play. Everyone says it's friendly, which is why we always found it strange that everyone stays inside during this time. I never thought to question it. Any excuse to be up in my room rotting my mind with movies and video games was always welcome. Amanda, though, was different, more adventurous and curious. She was a social butterfly with plenty of friends. Contrastingly, I could count the number of kids I regularly interacted with on one hand. Some may say I was antisocial. While I don't disagree, I think it's more that I simply wasn't a social seeker. I didn't shun people who tried talking with me, but I never struck up conversations. Hell, I hardly raised my hand in class unless it was to be excused. To this day, I'll never understand what quality I had that made her want to spend so much time with me. Before you make assumptions regarding young love, let me assure you that our dynamic was entirely platonic. In fact, if nobody in town knew us, we could have been mistaken for siblings. So what if I am crazy? She scoffed. It's better than being a wuss. Anyway, I already got it all planned out. She explained that she had nabbed her dad's camera and wanted us to sneak out and search for the cave. There was an excited glint in her gaze that was at odds with the bad idea feeling I was currently experiencing. Amanda, I don't mean to dash your hopes, but how would we even begin to find this thing? All the stories just say that it's in the forest. That's not a lot to go on. She grinned, indicating that she'd been expecting this sort of response. She unzipped her backpack, pulling out what looked to be an old journal. This belonged to one of the settlers. Where did you get that? I found it in the attic. My parents were making me clean it. Wait, so it belonged to someone in your family? She smiled, nodding. That's right, isn't it exciting? I looked at the journal again, the leather worn from age and cracking in several places. Have you already read that? Someone bookmarked a page. I only read that part. Why? Do you want to borrow it? No, that wouldn't be fair to you. It's fine. I already got what I wanted to know out of it. She dropped the book into my lap. The rest of our school day was uneventful, only being punctuated by the occasional remark from Amanda when our teachers weren't paying attention. We lived in the same neighborhood, and on the bus ride home, she caught me up on the latest gossip, having overheard her mum talking with her dad about it. You know Mr. Turner? Kind of. He lives across the street from you, right? Yeah, anyway, his wife caught him kissing another woman and kicked him out. That's pretty crazy. That's not the crazy part. You'll never guess who he was with. Shoot. Mrs. Hooper. I thought about how irritable she'd been the last few days. That explains a lot. It sure does. Then Mr. Hooper ran into Mr. Turner at the store and they got into a big fight. It was bad. They had to get the cops involved. One of them got a black eye and the other had to get stitches. As I was making a mental note to stay off the Hooper and Turner's radar for a while, the bus brakes were screeching as we came to our stop. We and some other kids got off. "Remember the equinox," Amanda said. I nodded. Then she was yelling for her friends to wait up while jogging after them. I watched her mingle with them before turning around and walking to my house. When I got home, my parents greeted me with the usual questions. How was school? Have you been talking with anyone new? That sort of thing. Dinner that night consisted of pumpkin chili and apple nut muffins for dessert. It was common for people in our town to have seasonal foods in the days leading up to autumn. "Hey," I spoke up, prompting my parents to look at me. I was wondering something about the fall shut-in. "What about it?" my dad replied, returning to his book. "Has anyone actually seen the fall fairy?" I may as well have questioned the existence of the sky with the way my parents were staring at me then. "Of course people have seen it. That's why we stay inside," my mum answered. "What does it look like then?" My dad slammed his book shut. Growing up, he was an intimidating man. He never beat me or anything. It's just that he carried himself in a very authoritative manner. When he spoke, there was always a finality to his voice to let me know he was entirely in control of the conversation. "You've never cared about this before," he said. "Why the sudden change?" "I heard someone at school talking about it and got curious." That was technically true. "Well, that's why you shouldn't eavesdrop," my mum told me. "We thought you would have learned that by now." This was coming from one of the biggest gossipers in town. I decided to drop the topic and finish eating my food. My dad talked with my mum about seeing if he could squeeze in a hunting trip with his buddies the day before the shut-in. Meanwhile, my mum was going shopping with one of her friends. Our town was behind the times in terms of technology, so cell phones or the internet weren't a thing for us. With my parents out of the house, it was going to be me by myself, which is something I have gotten used to. Reading was a big part of my childhood. It was always fascinating to catch these little glimpses into the outside world, even if the stories were out of date. I spent that night and the day before the equinox poring through the journal. Part of me is glad I read it before her. There were passages in it that would have made her ashamed of her family name. The short of it is, the natives, likely Cherokee based on the region, though the journal never specifies, lived here before our ancestors settled and, well, the transition of ownership wasn't peaceful. There was a name mentioned in one of those harrowing passages that was familiar to me. Going through my stuff, I realized it was the same as someone on a family tree project I did for school. That means someone I'm related to assisted in that slaughter. As if I wasn't already dealing with enough. I thought about bringing this up to my parents. However, I knew they would deny it. Everything had to be perfect. I'm not bringing this up to alleviate familial guilt, by the way. I do it because of the subtext present in those pages our ancestors chose to ignore. When our ancestors first invaded the land that would become Dead Leaf Falls, they noted how strangely the natives acted in response. They said of them it was like they were fighting to try and warn them away. I wish I could be surprised. If there's one thing people in our town were good at, it was ignoring problems staring them in the face. There are only 2 passages I can share verbatim due to them having been burned into my mind. The first is below. "We have finally managed to clear out the last of these savages. Now we can utilize this land as our Lord intended. I know in my heart this was right, and yet I am troubled. We looked into the eyes of our enemies in their final moments and saw no resentment, only relief." The second was written months later. "We were blind." That's where the journal ends. I wanted to tell Amanda, but she was so excited for our trip. I didn't want to deter her. There was something else I could do to ease my worry. My dad kept a gun cabinet in his trophy room. He never kept it locked because I never had any interest in weapons up to that point. The night Amanda and I met up, I snuck inside and swiped his revolver. He'd shown me how to use it when he decided to take me on one of his hunting expeditions. Once I had the gun, I tucked it away and then snuck out of the house. Amanda was waiting outside of the neighborhood. I could see her holding a flashlight and a camera hanging around her neck. "What took you so long? I've been here forever." "I had to get something." "You got your flashlight too?" "Yeah." "Good, follow me." Going through town was eerie. We figured there would at least be some patrol cars to make sure the shit-in was being abided. There was nothing which only deepened the apprehension running through me. Any Amanda might have been feeling was overridden by her enthusiasm. "The journal said the cave should be past the library, right?" I asked. "That's right. By the way, what did it say about my family?" "Just a bunch of dull stuff, mostly about fishing and hunting. According to the passage, the way to the Fall Fairy's cave would be past a special tree with the appearance of having a sleeping face carved into it. When the path opened, the tree was supposed to change, showing someone surprised. The library was built near it, and I wonder if it was built with the tree in mind." "I guessed it would be something like that," Amanda said. "Why do adults have to be so boring? Then they want to put all these rules on us and take the fun out of everything." I was silent as she continued talking while we were walking. As I said, I'll never understand what she saw in me. Looking back, I was a terrible friend. I hardly ever contributed to any conversation we were having. All I did was listen. "I see the library," Amanda exclaimed, shining her flashlight on it. She suddenly sprinted, causing me to race after her. We went past the library where at last we came to a stop. "How about a heads up next time?" I asked, catching my breath. "Tommy, you aren't going to believe this." Amanda had the expression of a toddler seeing Santa at the mall for the first time. Seeing that I was confused, she stepped aside, revealing the tree, and the eyes in the face were open. "Neither of us have seen it at night. For all we know, this is a trick of the light." Not even I believed what I was saying. Amanda gave me a smug grin. "I'm right and you know it," she told me, touching her finger to my nose. Annoyed, I brushed her hand away, then we headed into the forest. It didn't take us long to find the path. The mica in it sparkled under the moonlight, almost as if it was inviting us. I racked my brain for any logical explanation. Maybe I just hadn't noticed the path before. That was stupid. I'd been in and around the library at least 100 times, and I'd messed around in the forest behind it. There's no way I would have overlooked something so obvious. "Amanda, what is it? What if the Fall Fairy doesn't want to be bothered? I mean, something about this isn't sitting right with me." "Quit worrying. Fairies are friendly like in those old picture books." I touched the bulge of the revolver handle under my hoodie. "Look at that," Amanda said, pointing upward. The stars were twinkling. "Isn't it pretty?" "Sure, I guess." The more I stared at the stars, the more I got the sense they weren't twinkling but blinking. I wasn't paying attention and walked into Amanda. "Hey, watch it!" "Sorry, why'd we stop?" I looked past her, seeing the reason. It was the cave of the Fall Fairy. The entrance reminded me of the mouth of a jack-o'-lantern. "I don't believe it," I said. "And we're going to be the first ones to get a picture of the Fall Fairy, so get your flashlight ready." "Wait, how long are we going to wait for it to come out? We can't be out here all—" Picking up a rock, Amanda chucked it, hitting the cave. No sooner than she did, we hear a distinct chirping noise. Think something between a cicada and a cricket. I kept my flashlight steady. "I think I hear it coming," Amanda said excitedly. "I bet it's—" She was likely going to say something along the lines of pretty. The arm of it disproved this assumption and made all other animals go quiet. It was slender to the point of appearing mummified. Then its head came next. It hurts to think about, even all these years later. It was bald with a thin mouth and covered in eyes that were constantly changing position on its head. A pair of insect wings were protruding from its back. We took all this in within a few seconds. Instinctively, I cut off my flashlight. Amanda did the same. Any trace of wonder in her eyes was replaced with terror. Raising a shaking finger to my lips, I gestured for us to slowly back away. As we were attempting this, the Fall Fairy stepped out into the open. Even under the limited light of the moon, it was apparent how disproportionate that thing's body was. Its limbs contained multiple joints. The way it moved was like a gorilla. It stopped, sniffing the air. "No, oh no," I thought, trying to control my breathing. Its head whipped in our direction. The next thing we knew, it was rushing at us. All logic left me. The gun may as well have been on another planet, although it wouldn't have done any good against that creature anyway. It was fast. I cried out in pain, feeling a burning sensation as its hand wrapped around my ankle, yanking me upside down. I was face to face with it, all sound escaping me as I met its glare. I thought I was done for. However, its eyes were studying me, and in them, I could see what I can only describe as the kind of anger someone has when something isn't what they wanted. It tossed me away. I landed on my side, not the one with the revolver, thankfully. Getting back up, my hair rose to hear Amanda shrieking. That monster had her and was dragging her in its cave. She was screaming, digging her nails into the ground. Some of them were breaking off. I was about to try and help when I was grabbed. My mouth was covered, and all I could do was watch as my friend was pulled in. There was a shriek followed by snapping bone and blood spattering just outside the entrance. A numbing sensation overtook me. I glanced up to find my father looking down at me. He loosened his grip and I moved away. With him were people I knew, including my mum, the Hoopers, the Turners, and Amanda's parents. "Dad, there's a thing here," I stuttered. "It took Amanda. We need to—" He put up a hand to cut me off. His voice was disturbingly steady. It wasn't like he was trying to keep from panicking. No, he had the tone of someone who had been through this a dozen times. "Let us explain." That's when I learned everything. The thing we called the Fall Fairy has lived in those lands far longer than even the apes that would evolve into humans. The natives had a name for it. Roughly translated, it means the thing that crunches like the leaves. Speaking of the natives, they were the first to encounter it. They made a deal that as long as it didn't attack them and blessed their harvest, it could select one person from their tribe to be an offering every 100 years. The way it would do this is by sending out an orange and black-colored beetle. Whosoever home it landed in would have to pick one of their children to be sacrificed. While not ideal, this arrangement was stable for several millennia. Then our ancestors had to fuck everything up. Long story short, the Fall Fairy was furious, and a new bargain was crafted. The offerings would continue, except they would occur more frequently, now being every 22 years. The beetle came to Amanda's parents before she was even born. They planted the journal in the attic for her to find. I couldn't believe what they were saying. "You raised your daughter just to be food for that thing," I yelled. All the times Amanda told me about how they'd always seemed detached from her were making sense. "We have to serve it," her dad said. "It's for the good of Deadleaf," her mum added. The sacrifice was supposed to happen without any issues. Amanda was a curious girl after all, my dad told me. What we didn't expect was for you to be with her. "Kids don't normally learn the truth until they're older," my mum said. "It's over now. Let's all head back home." I backed away. "Fuck that," I spat. "I'm getting away from here." My parents were amused at this outburst. "You think you know anything about how shit works?" my dad asked. "You don't because you're a kid. We're adults and that's why we get to make the decisions." He signaled. He and my mum stood by as several people moved to grab me. That's when instinct took over again. It wasn't only the idea of living near that demon, it was having to live with these people. The second thing they hadn't expected was for me to pull out my dad's revolver. Their eyes went wide as I blindly fired. I got Amanda's parents, her mum in the foot, and I think her dad somewhere between the collarbone and shoulder. I was about to shoot again when my dad lunged. We wrestled for it briefly and it went off again. Of course, there was no way I was winning that struggle and he took it away. You know, I normally don't believe in corporal punishment, but... His eyes flashed with anger, and he backhanded me with the hand holding the gun. I was sent reeling and gasped as my back hit a tree, causing me to slide to the ground. Then my dad was lifting me by the front of my hoodie. I could only glare, fighting back tears. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. Whatever he was going to say was cut off by a distressed chirping noise. We turned to the cave, seeing the Fall Fairy emerge from it once more. Everyone, even my dad, was shocked, which means this wasn't normal behavior for it. Then we saw why. In its forehead was a circular wound. Its sight fell on the revolver in my dad's hand. Then it let out a low growling as the bullet in its head fell out, the injury sealing itself. That was the first and last time I would see my dad afraid. He tried firing in a panic and was slaughtered right beside me, covering me in his blood. My mum shrieked and was next. I didn't wait around. I randomly picked a direction and ran. Unfortunately, it also deemed me a target and wasn't keen on letting prey escape. I don't know how long that chase lasted, only minutes in all likelihood. It felt longer. During it, I tripped, twisting my ankle, yet I was too hopped up on adrenaline to notice. I scrambled up and kept going. Its pursuit didn't end so much as stop. I didn't even realize I had wandered into the middle of a road until someone's beams fell on me and they were slamming on their brakes. The driver got out, slamming their door, and was starting to lambast me until they could see the blood covering my body from head to toe. I was taken to a nearby police station. Even at that age, I knew my story was far-fetched, so I kept silent during their questioning. They chalked it up to trauma and decided I witnessed an animal attack. I spent the next few years bouncing between foster homes. That was a special kind of hell I don't even want to begin describing right now. I mean, I can't blame the people I lived with entirely. There's not a therapist in the world equipped to deal with what I did, especially as a child. When I was old enough, I joined boot camp and ended up with a decent military career. At the very least, it gave some stability, and I even got some buddies out of it I still keep in touch with. For them, I am grateful. Nothing left to say then, right? Not quite. The fall fairy left me with a hand-shaped scar where it grabbed my ankle. You'd think it was simply a birthmark if you didn't know the context. The thing is, every time autumn arrives, it starts getting hot. Every year, the heat gets more severe. Ice can only help so much. I know it's calling me back. I've researched what it is over the years. The fairy part of its name makes it seem like a no-brainer, I know, but I don't know if it can be put into the Fae category. Whatever it is, I've stocked up on several special kinds of ammo I've managed to get from all over. If I'm lucky, one of them will do the job. I'm currently on a road trip and I'm posting this from my hotel room. It's been a long drive. The equinox is tomorrow and I'm feeling a little homesick. Have you ever had the feeling that you're being watched? Like eyes are prying into you, trying to dig their way deep into your soul? Because that's how I've felt for the past 2 days. I don't know what to do, or how I can make it stop. I've never posted on something like this before, but at this point I'm willing to try anything. I'm desperate for some advice. I'll take you back to the start, or what I assume to be the start of it all. I live a fairly ordinary life. I'm a 21-year-old guy, living on his own in a bit of a rundown flat, commuting to work on the train every day. This doesn't leave me a lot of spare time for anything else, really, because my commute is an hour each way. My days consist of waking up at 6:30, getting dressed, walking to the train station, catching the train, walking to work, working, and then doing the same process in reverse. That's it. I don't really have any friends to hang out with, and I'm not exactly on the best terms with my family, for reasons I won't go into here. So I sit on my own each evening, watching TV or playing video games. I keep myself to myself and get on with my life. Now you may be thinking that my life sounds pretty miserable or boring, but to me it's perfect. I've always been a bit of a loner, so my daily routine suits me perfectly, and I've been living happily like this for the past year. That is until a dream I had 3 nights ago. Like all dreams, it didn't have a beginning. I was simply there. No recollection of opening my eyes in this new place, or how I'd got there. I was standing in the middle of a large grassy field. I could feel the wind blowing gently on my face, and I ran my hand through the large grass strands that stretched up from the ground to meet me. I looked around and realized I was alone. The field was empty, save for a lone tree a few hundred feet away from me. I started to make my way over to it, not knowing why I was doing so, but just having the feeling that there was something there I needed to see. As I got closer, I could make out the faint shape of letters carved into the wood. From where I was standing, I couldn't quite make out what they were, and so I decided to get closer for a better look. And that's when I felt it for the first time. Even in my dream, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a chill went down my spine. I could tell that I was no longer alone. Someone else was here watching me. I span myself around and caught the first glimpse of them. They were far away, so far away that all of their features were obscured by the distance. All I could make out was a featureless shadow, standing in the grass, watching me. I stood for what seemed like hours, just staring back at them, unsure of what to do. And then they started to run. The figure lurched forwards with impossible speed, heading straight for me. Instinctively, I span back around and began to take off in the opposite direction, towards the tree. The words on the tree were becoming clearer, but I still couldn't make out what they were yet. As I ran through the grass, trying desperately not to trip on the uneven terrain, I glanced behind me to ascertain how much distance I had left between me and my pursuer. Not much. It had impossible speed, coming at me like a steam train, closing the gap between us in a matter of seconds. It would only be a few more until it was on me. I began to panic and tried to pick up my pace, but as is the curse of most dreams, I was running at a snail's pace. My foot slipped and I was sent crashing to the ground. I flipped over just in time to see my pursuer pouncing on top of me. I could see now that it was not the distance that had caused it to look featureless. It was featureless. Just a black hole of pure energy in the shape of a person. It brought its hands up to my face, placing them on either side of my eyes. I began to cry and plead with it, begging it not to hurt me. It didn't listen. Instead, it plunged its dark thumbs into my eye sockets, blocking my vision and causing me to scream out in pain. And then I was awake, screaming still. I scanned my room, looking for the creature, but I was alone. Fucking stupid nightmare, I muttered to myself as I led back down, trying to slow my breathing and calm myself down. I managed to eventually get back to sleep and awoke at 6:30 to my normal alarm buzzing next to me. I got up and began to get ready for work as normal, when my mind drifted back to my nightmare. I tried to think of the letters I had seen carved into the wood of the tree, but all I could remember were "Eram nonixim noenis." There was still a lot more carved into it, but in my panic I couldn't make out the rest. Whatever, I thought to myself. I left my building and began my walk to the train station, the thoughts of my dream already beginning to fade from my memory, chalked up to nothing more than a stupid dream caused by a scary video game or something. You'd be surprised by how quiet the streets are in a big town at 7 a.m. No one trying to sell you things, no one bumping into you or pushing past. Most of the time it's just me and the road, nice and quiet. It was the same on Thursday morning, but as I got closer to the train station, I began to get a familiar feeling. The hairs on the back of my neck began to stand up, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned around slowly, hoping to just see another commuter making their way to work behind me. The street was still clear, with no sign of anyone else having been there other than me. I breathed a sigh of relief and shook my head, thinking that the previous night's dream was just playing tricks on my mind. However, as I began to turn my head back in the direction I was traveling, my eyes caught a glimpse of someone standing behind a lamppost. Only half of their body was visible, the other half hidden behind the metal pole. They were standing about 200 meters from me, so I couldn't easily make out any of their features. All I could see was an eye glistening in the reflection of the streetlight. Whoever it was watching me, motionless. I stood for a moment, debating what to do. I brought my hands up to my face and momentarily covered my eyes as I rubbed them. When I removed my hands once more, the figure was gone. I let out a faint laugh, cursing myself for being so stupid as to believe someone was watching me. It was most likely just someone making their way to work, just like me. They had momentarily stopped to look at me, the only other person on the street, just as I had done to them. And then they had moved on, got on with their day, just as I had to do now as well. The rest of the day went by as usual, with nothing out of the ordinary to report. That is, until I was on the way home. I got on the train home as I normally would, and we set off back towards my hometown. There are a number of stops between where the train begins and where it ends, with the carriages steadily becoming quieter and quieter as the journey progresses. By the time it reaches the final stop, I am normally the only person left in the carriage, which I am more than okay with, as it means no one has to sit next to me. As the train slowed to ready itself for the next station, I felt my hairs stand on end once more. I sighed at myself. Not again, I thought, wishing that my brain would stop playing tricks on me. It was clearly hanging on to the dream more than I had thought, and was not letting not go any time soon. The train slowed to a halt, and the doors hissed open to allow any passengers to get off. It was a quiet station in the evening, and so the platform was deserted, save for the shape of a lone person standing at the far end of the platform. It had been raining, and so my window was covered in thin streams of water, obscuring the figure and making it seem as though they were a strange shape, almost as if you were looking at yourself in a funhouse mirror. Their body seemed twisted and deformed, no longer even resembling the shape of a human. The thought of it sent more chills down my spine, and as the doors hissed shut and the train pulled off, I silently thanked the gods that we weren't delayed. When I climbed into bed that night, I prayed that my brain wouldn't force me to experience another one of its concoctions, and that I would just be able to forget the whole thing had ever happened. But my mind, once again, had other plans. I was standing in the middle of a crowded street, streams of people passing around me. I glanced down and found that I was dressed in my work clothes, consisting of a shirt, tie, and smart pants. I felt at the tie and let it slip through my fingers. The silk felt so real. I looked back up to the street and found myself surrounded by staring faces. Everyone had stopped what they were doing and was staring at me, their mouths hanging slightly open in a look of shock and awe. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. All those sat in coffee shops, in the flats above me, and in cars all stared at me through the glass of their windows, the same expressions resting on their faces. They were unmoving, unbreathing, unfeeling. All emission had drained from them, as though they were statues. And then as one, they took a step closer. Faces squished against the windows as those inside the buildings tried to get closer, seemingly unaware there was something in the way. I began to panic as the space between me and the crowd lessened as they moved closer once more. They were a single organism, moving together as though the individual bodies were simply limbs controlled by one malevolent force. There was now only a meter between me and the nearest person, and this gap was closed before I was able to react. I felt hands grabbing at me, ripping my shirt, grasping my tie and pulling it, tightening its grip around my throat and cutting off my oxygen supply. "Please, stop," I choked, pushing and shoving at the mass of bodies, desperate to get them away. I was met with a deafening reply, as every mouth began chanting the same thing. My memory of what they were saying is pretty hazy, but from what I can remember, it sounded something like, "Ui mae, emera ui." The voices were dark, inhuman. I felt as though my eardrums would burst at the volume of the chanting, the vibrations reverberating through my body. I was being crushed from all sides, my clothes being ripped off, my skin being ripped at and scratched by unrelenting hands. I cried out in pain, and as with the previous night, I was awake, still screaming. I looked at my hands and found that I was shaking. My ears were ringing, as though they had been exposed to a high volume in the night. I picked up my phone and checked the time, 5:47. Screw it. I thought to myself, there wasn't a chance I was going back to sleep after that. I climbed out of bed and walked to my bathroom. I splashed cold water onto my face in an attempt to wake myself up and make me think rationally about the situation. All that had really happened was I had had a couple of bad dreams and seen two people obscured by various things. That was it. Nothing unnatural about that. I breathed slower now, the rational side of my brain slowly beginning to take hold. As I brought my head back up to look at myself in the mirror, I noticed a shadow standing in my shower, obscured by the shower curtain that had been pulled across. I gasped, and my blood ran cold. I was frozen by fear as I stared into the reflection. Whoever was in the shower was facing the mirror as well, their shape clearly visible. They were unmoving, as still as a statue. I slowly turned myself around to face the curtain, the shape of the intruder still visible. Tears began to form in my eyes as I reached out a hand. I grasped the fabric, and in one quick motion yanked the curtain across to expose the figure. It was empty. I let out an audible mix of relief and fear as I brought my shaking hands up to my head. I went into work early that day. I couldn't really focus properly on what I was doing, my mind filled with thoughts of my follower. Whatever it wasn't a figment of my imagination. I had definitely seen a figure standing in my bathroom, watching me. It had been in my flat, feet away from me. I traveled home as usual, thankfully not having the feeling I was being watched at all. I stepped off the train onto the platform and followed the few others that had got off down the nearby stairs that led to the exit. The stairs lead down to a small tunnel under the station, lit by crappy lights that flicker occasionally. At the end of the tunnel is a corner where a set of stairs live, leading up to the entrance of the station. Next to this corner is a mirror, placed onto the wall near the ceiling, allowing you to see if anyone is about to turn the corner, preventing you from bumping into them. As I neared the corner, I glanced up at the mirror and found that there was someone standing just round it. They were wearing a shirt that seemed to be 2 sizes too small for them, and a tie that looked as though it was choking them. A mass of lumpy skin bulged through the gaps between the shirt's buttons. I stopped in my tracks, just before the corner. I looked into the mirror closer, and even though they were hunched over, I could see that the person's head was deformed, as though it was just piles of skin thrown together clumsily. I could hear it wheezing, as if the simple act of breathing was causing it immense pain. I could feel tears beginning to well in my eyes again as I felt my hairs stand on end once more. Shit, 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 I whispered to myself, trying to hype myself up just enough to make the 3 steps to the turn. Every part of my body wanted to turn around and run in the opposite direction, but I resisted. I was startled by a shout from behind me, and turned around to see the cause, only to find a group of kids running down the steps, cheering and joking with each other. I turned back to face the mirror, and found that the figure was gone again. Just like in the morning, I took a few shaky steps forward and turned the corner, confirming that there was no one there. And then last night I had the worst dream yet. I found myself standing back in my bathroom, brushing my teeth. I could taste the mint of the toothpaste as I brushed, spitting out the foam into the sink below. I brought my head back up and stared at myself in the mirror. I was met with a twisted, deformed version of myself, smiling maniacally at me. I stepped backwards, and he stepped forwards, his head protruding from the glass as though it were an open window. A crooked, broken hand reached up onto the frame, and in one smooth motion, the body slithered out, pulling itself through. It flopped onto the sink, smacking its head onto the porcelain and causing it to bleed. I fell backwards as I retreated, stumbling into the bathtub. I sat and watched in horror as the being got to its feet, the bones cracking as it twisted, its broken body around to face me. The mirror me continued to smile as he began to move towards me. At this point, I was paralyzed with fear as he began the same chant as the previous night. Ui ma'e em era ui, ui ma'e em era ui. Please, please don't hurt me, I cried as the shaking, twisted hands reached out towards my face. I turned my face away from the creature and braced myself for the inevitable. When I opened them again, I was back in my bed. My breathing was heavy and my head hurt. I groaned as I sat up. I raised my hand and rested it on my forehead, trying to nurse the pain. When I made contact with my skin, I found that I was covered in something sticky. I pulled my hand away and grabbed my phone, shining the torch onto my palm. It was covered in blood. I felt my forehead again and could feel a deep cut in the flesh. I winced in pain as I touched it and realized that the wound was extremely fresh. I tried my best to clean the wound in the bathroom and wrapped a bandage from my first aid kit around my head. In the hallway outside my flat, the lights are controlled by a movement sensor. It's pretty bad and only stays on for a few seconds, even if you keep moving. As I walk back to my bedroom, I notice that the light is on outside. I walk up to the door and double-check the lock. The light goes off as I get nearer, but as I turn away from the door, I see it switch back on, the light glowing under the door. I move back into my bedroom and open my laptop. That is where I am now, writing this, asking for help. I don't know what to do, or how I can stop this. All I know is that whatever is following me, it's getting closer, more confident. I know it is outside my door. The hair on the back of my neck is on end. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.